Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver, and today we're talking about leadership, church leadership, pastoral leadership, and really this is for anyone looking to lead people, especially in a church setting, as one of the books specifically will point out that this is very important to look at leadership in almost any setting. And we'll start with that book today that is called Spiritual Leadership, Moving People Onto God's Agenda. Now, in another episode, we looked at the topic of leadership. There was another book called Spiritual Leadership. This is not it. This is a different one by Henry and Richard Blackaby, father-son team, and you'll recognize the Blackaby name from the Experiencing God series. And, it's been said that I think of some of the best authors, even some of the best speakers, that once you've seen one book by them or once you've heard one message from them, you've really heard or seen it all. That's said about Billy Graham, of all people, about John Piper, for example. And I think the same is very much true about the Blackabys, and that's not a criticism. I think that's very good. I think it means that, well, they've hit on a theme. There's something that's very important, something it's been downloaded into their spirit by God, and is something that the church needs and something that we need to hear, and it needs to be looked at, explored, talked about from different angles. So I think that's what the Blackabys are doing here. Again, I think that's a very good thing. Now, the Experiencing God material was always about knowing what God is doing and then joining Him in that process. Well, spiritual leadership then turns into knowing what God is doing, following Him in that process, and now we're inviting other people to follow us as we follow Christ. Not a bad model for leadership, and you'll recognize that's the Apostle Paul's model and method as well. So I want to talk to you about the contents of this book, and it is all about leadership, of course. He goes into really being the right person, being the leader, and becoming the right leader. Now, there is a debated topic. I think that it's not hard to understand that a leader can be made. There are certain attributes, attitudes, personality types even, that are immutable, that really can't change, and that would set people up naturally to be a leader. But I believe also that a leader can be made, a leader can be developed and strengthened by just doing some very practical things, some very simple things. And over time, a person who was not naturally necessarily gifted as a leader can become so. So I think that this kind of book is recognizing that and is very helpful towards that end. And so he talks about the leader's challenge, the leader's role, the leader's preparation, how God even develops leaders, how biblical examples and examples out in history over the church over time, how leaders have been developed. Also, how a leader gets a vision for their leadership and then how to help people to pursue that. One of the key points and strengths of this book that I think is so important, I've pointed this out in other books, we could look at what's great about leadership and how to be a great leader and all these great success stories about leaders in the past, leaders in the Bible, and there's wonderful things that they've done and what they were able to accomplish and how happy they were, how fulfilled they were, but never talk about the downside of leadership. I think if you look at it that way, the Bible doesn't even do that. The Bible very clearly articulates that there, yes, are great leaders whom God has raised up, but also that they've had great downfalls. They've had great times of depression. They've had times of defeat. They've had times of personal sin that they had to struggle with, and you know the examples. It's Jeremiah. There's David. There's certainly Elijah, and so many others. Peter had a great fall, but then a great a time to come back in strength to be God's man. So yes, there are great highlights to being a leader, great mountaintop kind of experiences, but there are also great challenges. And when you face those pitfalls, and that's one of the titles, in fact, the leader's pitfalls, what can disqualify a leader. Even as we record this today, there has recently been a leader who's been very public in church planting and church pastoring over the years and planting many, many churches, and he's taken a fall. Well, how has that happened? I won't go into his personal story, but there are pitfalls of ministry, of leadership, things that you will, as a leader, let yourself just go astray with, and one tiny little judgment error will lead to another one and a greater one, and it sometimes will result in really losing your ministry. And sometimes, and that's what Blackaby is talking about here, what disqualifies a minister, a leader, a pastor, what disqualifies that man from being able to do the work that God has led him to do, has equipped and called and qualified him to do. Well, this book is helping you to see these are the ways to avoid that kind of thing. What I like about one of the strengths of this book is at the end of each chapter, I always want to tell you what are the highlights here for me, is where you can come back to, in this book, there are bullet points that will summarize the chapters, and it will show you, in fact, this heading at the end of every chapter is called Concepts and Scriptures for Consideration. So just as an example of the chapter on the Leader's Challenge, it says that at a time of renewed societal interest in spiritual things, many churches and denominations are declining. Also, paradoxically, it says, concurrent with the church's discovery of popular leadership axioms, secular writers have been discovering the timeless truths of Christianity. And so the reminder is that these truths that are found in God's Word and just waiting to be discovered by the wise reader, the wise leader and pastor, is that these truths are good and they're true and they're always true for whatever setting, whatever environment you're in. So if you're a church leader, this book is for you. If you're a leader of any group of people, I think this is also a great book for you to pick up. And then he gives scripture passages. Sometimes at the end of each chapter, it's a verse or two that he'll give, but he gives a whole list. And maybe it's a verse or two at a time. Maybe it's a section, a passage of Scripture for you to look through and reinforce some of the truths and the points of what's going on in the chapters. I want to show you a couple of other features in this book. In the chapter on the leader's role, he said that spiritual leaders don't try to satisfy the goals of and ambitions of people they lead, but they try to lead with understanding the goals of the God they serve. That's the most important thing, leader, pastor. Spiritual leadership, he says, is moving people onto God's agenda. There's that Blackaby line that it is knowing what God is doing and then following him in that. Now, a spiritual leader is just to take people and moving people onto God's agenda, helping people to follow that, again, as you follow Christ in that leadership. I want to let you know also that the Blackabys borrow pretty heavily from other books. They take a lot of the strengths, a lot of the key themes and points out of other leadership books, which I think is good. It gives you kind of a broad range of helps in this. For example, there's a model that they use from Robert Clinton, who is a professor at Fuller Seminary, who wrote The Making of a Leader. And there's a 6-stage model of how God develops leaders. For example, phase 1, sovereign foundations. Phase 2, inner life growth. There's ministry maturing, life maturing, convergence, and celebration of that ministry. So you see these are phases that they work through here. Then they'll go through and talk about each of the phases of ministry as Robert Clinton has outlined that. And I think that's helpful. That's good to see it from another perspective, and then what the Blackabys would take with that. There's also another, one of the last things I want to tell you about this book is that the leader's schedule, doing what's important, is one of the chapters, chapter 9, and they talk about taking control of your time, making sure that your time is used wisely, not in frivolous conversations about what's going on, even in politics and sports and in looking at the newspaper headlines or whatever headlines come up on your phone or your devices, that those things they can be good, but you've got to be going somewhere with it. You've got to make sure that your time is used, because your time is valuable. You don't get it back, and it needs to be used well and for the leadership that God has called you to. So don't kind of fritter your time away with doing that. Make sure that you build in the family time. That's so important. He also reminds us that leaders say no sometimes. There are things that as people see you and you're going all the time and you're always busy and you're getting things done, that people are going to ask you, hey, can you do this thing for me? And in their mind, maybe it's just another half hour in your day. Maybe it's just one little thing that they're asking you to do, but it really doesn't match with how God has called you or God has gifted you or what He is leading you to do in your ministry at this season in life. And sometimes a good leader just has to say no and protect that time, guard the time that you have. Now, as he talks about cultivating a healthy routine, of course, the importance of prayer, the importance of quiet time and personal study, that's not studying for an upcoming Bible study or sermon that you're about to lead or preach or teach, that those are so important for you to build in. Also, the fact that a leader delegates, that he said that the smaller the team size sometimes, that as churches, as organizations try to function, that the smaller your team size is, the natural tendency is for you to take control of all of those areas of that ministry or that organization that are not being done, and for you to do those things and you to kind of become the micromanager there, make sure that everything is done. But a good leader will see that, and again, guarding his time or her time, then he will delegate and find the strengths, and find people who are also gifted in those areas, and maybe, how about this, even more gifted than you are in that. And that's certainly possible. I know that, I'll just speak for myself, that there are things that other people are much better at than I am, much more efficient, and they just do a better job. And so it's incumbent upon me as a leader to be able to give that out, to share that opportunity with somebody else, to allow them to shine and to do what God has called them to do. Again, I mentioned the leader's pitfalls, and he talks about the usual things of pride and really, again, protecting your time, making sure that you don't fall into those pitfalls of pride or sexual sin, or it's just easy to mishandle money, and for that to really look like a great downfall in your ministry. It's so alluring sometimes. So there's also you have to safeguard against cynicism and greed and even mental laziness. He talks about as some of the pitfalls of leadership, or that they talk about as the Blackabys have written this book. So this is Spiritual Leadership, Moving People Onto God's Agenda by Henry and Richard Blackaby. Highly recommend this book, and it's something that you need to have and to refer to often as you go through different seasons, different stages of your ministry, your leadership, your work, if you're in a secular environment, your organization. And so I think that's helpful as any believer, especially looking to lead any group of people. I think that's helpful. I want to point you to this next one that is called Look Before You Lead. It's by Aubrey Malphurs, who runs an organization called the Malphurs Group, which is a kind of a church planting leadership organization. And the subtitle is How to Discern and Shape Your Church Culture. So this is very specific to a church, very specific in some ways to church leadership. But what I'm reminded of as I look at this book and as I reviewed it again just recently is that as you step into any church environment, as you're at any level of leadership in a church, that as you go into that, you are just by means of walking into that office, into that church, you are stepping into a whole different culture from the one that you came from. Maybe the church looks the same. Maybe you can recognize certain personality types, or you recognize that this is that kind of person with whom I've dealt before, and I can kind of understand what their motivations are and what they're going to do and how they're going talk and how to respond to them. But you know what? You're in a brand new environment as you step into almost any church setting, that you are in a new culture. And really, the reason that they've called you, the reason that they've looked into your resume and interviewed you and talked with you, is because they have either had a void in their ministry, maybe somebody just left, maybe they recognize there's a need, and maybe the void that's left there has been one that wasn't done so well before. Maybe the church is failing. Maybe the church is in a period of decline, whether emotionally, spiritually, numerically, financially. Maybe it's all of the above, but you step into a brand new culture, and what's the purpose of you getting into that culture? Is to improve it, right? Is to use the gifts that God has given you, use the way that God has designed you to lead people, and to as the Blackaby said, and to get them into God's agenda, and to do what God has called you to do there, and make that church, that group of people, the church, to be all that God has called them to be in their community for this time. And so Malphurs is looking at this as really a cultural exchange, as he's divided this book really into three parts. That the first part prepares you for wrestling with yours or another congregational culture, and prepares you for the upcoming parts of the book. But he addresses the basics of congregational culture, how that church as a congregation, how that people sits in a community, and the impact that they have or unfortunately don't have in that particular community, and the importance of that culture. He goes through chapter by chapter and defines the culture of that church and that community. Part 2 is going to guide readers in looking at discovering congregational culture, how to discover that church culture, and how a leader, such as a pastor, can discover that culture that he brings with him to the church he seeks to lead, and what that looks like to bring those people onto God's program, plan for that church. Part 3 is going to move the leader from now reading and studying that culture to shaping the culture. And so it's not enough to just understand the church's culture, know where they're coming from, and be able to articulate that culture. But now, how do we change it? How do we help them to shape and change to form a robust, vibrant Christian community that is God-honoring in that place? And so, how do we go about doing that? So this is where he steps a little bit into not only into going into a new church, but now going into a community and building up a church from that. We call that church planting. How you build a new church in a community, how you look to do that, and what are the best ways to accomplish what you're looking to do there to build that new church culture in an environment. He talks about the importance of building on beliefs, the solid beliefs that your church is going to be known by, and how you will be planted and seated in that community. What is so powerful about this book is that he gives very practical steps. There are so many things that, as he gives personal examples from other pastors, he has questions at the end of the chapters. There is scripture throughout. I mean, multiple times, page after page. I'm just looking again here that there are scripture passages here, references that are made, and so I like the strong biblical nature of this book. Now, also at the end of the book are the appendices, and you might think, well, there are just one or two helps there. It goes from A through, I think I saw an appendix N, and so there are personality studies. There are checklists of, as you walk into a new church, here's what you should look for. As you maybe plant a church, here are some of the things that you need to make sure are taken care of. Here are the church behaviors, looking at your neighborhood and community. Where are your church people going to park What about the ethnicities of your church, and how do you minister well to the different ethnicities, the different cultures that come from outside of your church into your church culture? Look at the demographics of your community and of your church. Look at languages. What languages do you hear? Would people expect to hear messages in? What languages would people love to sing in their heart language, and really experience God in such an emotional way through music? What do the church grounds look like? What about signage? And what about the friendliness of your church? What about the way that the phone is answered in your church? So, I mean, there are really bullet point checklists of all kinds of things in this book that would help you as almost a one book guide to be able to set up, to move into an existing church, to develop a new church structure, any of the above, whether you're planting or merging a church or revitalizing a church. These are so important. And then he looks at, there's an appendix about the core values of your church and how you would position your church's beliefs and your core value statements, your mission statements for your church, your personality type, which you may not think is important, but is important as you think about how you lead other people and what's the most effective ways maybe for you to do that. So many so helpful tools in this book in the appendix section. So I want you to know about that as well. And he talks about so many of the personality types and temperaments, things that you'll want to know about yourself and about other people who you're leading. So this is so important for somebody who is looking to go into a new church, especially to know, well, how do I go in with eyes wide open in this church, in this setting? How are we going to do this well in a way that can honor God the most? So this is called Look Before You Lead, How to Discern and Shape Your Church Culture by Aubrey Malphurs. The final book today is called Leading on Empty, Refilling Your Tank and Renewing Your Passion. It is by Wayne Cordeiro, who has been a part of planting over 100 churches in the Pacific Rim. He now pastors in Hawaii, which, believe it or not, is, I understand, a very tough church setting, a hard evangelical setting to be in there. It's maybe a beautiful place, but it's hard to minister there. And he has done that well. And again, churches all over the Pacific Rim he's helped us set up. And let me tell you about the foreword of this book. Talks about the difference between these two church leaders. And here's just the summary of it. It says, the first person I want to describe leads a church in the western United States. And he has said at one point, this is a quote from that pastor, not from Wayne Cordeiro, but he says, this pastor says, I felt fried inside. I lost enthusiasm for what I was doing, and the work that had been a great passion for me had become just a job. I was dragging myself from day to day, and finally sought medical help, and the doctor diagnosed burnout. And so he talked with his church talked with the elders, and he developed a plan. How do we get the joy back into day-to-day ministry and serving these people here, and really assessing that for yourself? Now, the second pastor he talks about leads a large church, he says, on the opposite side of the country from this other pastor, and he also began to experience burnout, but he had kind of internalized it. He was taking all of these jobs in the church and treating his very large church as if it was a small church of 100 people, and trying to be personal with everybody he could, and trying to do so many of the things in the church. I used the term micromanage before. He was trying to do all of those things and not really sharing that with anybody. Well, he found himself just immersed in a particular sin that led him away, and people knew that he might have been not happy all the time with his work and his service in the church, that he was not necessarily doing his very best in things. He was kind of coasting in some areas because he was so focused on other things. And he found himself in the midst of of abusing prescription drugs to numb the pain that he was experiencing due to his stress and his work level. And so through never talking about it, he found himself abusing those things, and eventually led him to leaving the ministry in disgrace. Well, so Wayne Cordeiro sets up this distinction, this difference between these two pastors as a great illustration for, okay, this is the problem. Pastor, don't be the second illustration that we gave, but be the first one. In fact, that first story is Wayne Cordeiro's own story, and how he found that his approach to protecting himself against burnout, protecting his ministry against burnout, was so important. And so one of the chapters here is even called the early warning signs, and how you look at the things that are going on in your life as some of the ways to detect that you're having burnout in your life. He gives quotations. There are, if you're viewing this, you can see there are quotations that are set apart in here that are from some secular speakers and authors. Some are from Christian authors. He quotes Charles Spurgeon heavily in here, which I like, of course. And but this quotation is from William James, and he quotes Anne Lamott. He quotes Arthur Schopenhauer, philosopher. The Spurgeon quote is, "Anxiety does not empty tomorrow of its sorrows, but only empties today of its strength." And this is one of the warning signs of depression. In fact, he covers quite a bit of Spurgeon's quotes in there, because Charles Spurgeon himself dealt with depression quite a bit. So he talks about the sense of hopelessness and difficulty concentrating on your work as a minister, having irritability, touchiness, lowered activity levels, feeling alone in ministry. And he gives the story, reminds us of the story of Elijah, who felt like he was all alone in ministry. And God says, no, there are 7,000 in Israel. Look up, Elijah. Remember that these are all the knees that have not bowed to the Baal, but I have 7,000 who are on your side and on my side, more importantly, on God's side. So these are some of the warning signs that Wayne Cordeiro is talking about here in this book. And then, so recognizing that there's a problem, and being able to identify that problem, he says, so how do you protect yourself from that? Well, this chapter is called Finding the Still Waters. And those are the things about the spiritual disciplines, doing the things that really do refill your tank. If you want to talk about that in the terms of the common terminology of the filling your love tank, and he doesn't talk about that, but that filling the tank terminology does come in. So do the things that recharge you, that will replenish your usefulness, and that make you look into your ministry again and say, man, that's really a place where I thrive and where I feel like I'm gifted and God is really using that. And so, step into those, lean into those opportunities and areas of ministry that are so important. And it's very important that you recharge regularly, daily, in fact, with personal Bible study, with prayer. And he is going to strongly recommend that, that pastors follow what God has told us to do. How about that? So, yes, the Bible says that we ought to work 6 days and then take a Sabbath. Well, for a pastor, Sunday is kind of the key work day, but we need to build in, as really any person trying to follow what God has designed for us to do, that we need to work 6 days, absolutely, but we need to have a day of Sabbath. We need to have even periods of Sabbath. I think day by day, each day, we need to have some kind of Sabbath. I mean, steal a Sabbath minute, 5 minutes, sometime that you would have that's just downtime, that's just a time to relax and to check back in with God. Make sure that's in addition to times of prayer, in addition to times of Bible study. But he makes sure that he says to make sure that you build in and protect those times that you're able to do that. And then he's going to, again, strongly recommend that you would have a season this is not a sabbatical, but that you have some kind of, even a few days to step away from your day to day, the ebb and flow of ministry, that you step out of that flow for a little bit, for just a few days, sometimes a week, a couple of weeks, whatever you can do, whatever that you're able to do, and just have a retreat. It might be with other people of other pastors. It might be with, so you can get a little bit of instruction, you can get a little bit of fellowship and strength from other people who are in similar situations that you are. It may just be alone, and that you would use that time to think and to pray, to study, to reflect, whatever would be most appropriate to you to be able to recharge and reflect on ministry, and then get recharged and excited again to recover the joy, to restore the joy that you've had of ministry. So he says, again, I love this part that he says that now if you think you've gone too far and you're already at the point of burnout, there's a chapter right at the end here called Finding the Way Back Home. Now, if you think you've gone too far, here's how to do this. Look ahead to the future, write down what your goals in ministry are, and then discover what God would have you to do. Submit to life coaching, submit to somebody who's going to help you to determine and to move into and just take on that challenge of what God has called you to do, to be all that you are meant to be in God's service and really as God's person. Before you even think about leading other people, who has God made you to be? And as you follow Him, then other people can follow you in that. So his book ends with the thought of being intentional in life, giving yourself grades on things like your faith life, your marriage life, your family life. And so those are the top three, as they should be in importance. And then your office life and the, not do you get work done in your office, but what does the office look like? Is it kind of cluttered, which is really hard to do work in, or are you able to take care of that? So grade yourself A, B, C, D, or F on these things, and your ministry, your social life, your physical life, and all of these areas. Just make sure that you're honest with yourself and honest before God as you do that. But he says that you will find great solitude in sabbaticals if you will make yourself take those. The final thing I'll point out in this book is that the afterword in here is talking about the appendix gives some retreat centers, counselors that are possible, that are available, some books to check for further options, how to find a good counselor, and then books for the journey that will help you in determining the way forward and how to protect yourself and how to get yourself out of burnout, out of that depression if you're dealing with that. And he gives several pages of recommended resources that are, again, books for the journey. I think that always in these books, as I've said before, that as you look at a book and you think that this will be a great book for me to read, maybe somebody's put it in your hand, maybe it's something that you have had on a shelf for a while and not read it, go ahead and admit that you do that, because I do the same thing. There are books up there that I've not touched. That's all right. We'll get to it. But you might think, well, now that I've read this book, I can check that off, and that's one less that I have to read. I think that the great books, the really great books that you're reading, are going to mushroom. They're going to lead into 2, 3, 10 more books that you ought to read or that you think would be helpful for you to read because they were instructive to this author, or they're ones that maybe he would recommend to you to read, just as Wayne Cordeiro has done at the end of this book. But so that's what this book has done for me and made me recognize, man, there are a lot more things that I would like to know here. And there's just, sometimes there are, too many books, too little time. But you go with God's leading on what is going to be best for you. This one's called Leading on Empty, Refilling Your Tank and Renewing Your Passion by Wayne Cordeiro. Well, these are the books from my shelves that have been helpful to me in my ministry, and I hope this gives you a bit of direction as you prayerfully consider which resources will best help you and the people you are ministering to. Thanks for listening to the Church Resource. Please make sure that you give us a review, and if you have any suggestions of resources that you would like us to look at, please email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com. That's thechurchresource@gmail.com.